When I'm doing talks, I always like to show people these books because this is where my reality as a writer started. On notepads, working in a factory that hired me to sweep floors. This was 20 years ago. It's 20 years since I wrote my first book. Before that, I think I was 32 when it first came out. Before that, I worked in factories, worked in shops, worked on building sites. I did a plethora of different jobs. So I understand the reality of a normal working guy. I've done that. I was brought up with that. You know, my dad worked in factories all his life. My brothers, my sister did exactly the same. Everybody in my world, in fact, worked in factories and did, I guess, what you would call menial jobs. I was always one of these guys that just, you know, when you just suspect there's more out there, you just think there's more out there. I know there's more out there. There's got to be more out there. But I was so afraid of accessing that. I was so afraid of going out and trying it. And every time I did move towards it, I had this part of me, this kind of voice on the hard drive that would say to me, "Who do you think you are? And people like you don't write books. People like you don't, write plays. People like you don't write films. Be grateful for what you've got. This job you've got at the factory is a job for life. They don't grow on trees." This was information that was in me, and it was placed in me by the people that love me, by the people around me, by society around me, and it kept me in place. I'm not saying that it was deliberate. I'm not saying that it was there was a conspiracy to try and stop Geoff Thompson from doing well. I'm just saying people taught me what they knew, and the fear was there to protect me from going out and getting myself into trouble. So people put this information in me for the right reason. But I knew innately that this information wasn't right. I just knew, I always knew. So I've got this massive creative energy wanting to come out of me, and every time it wanted to come out of me, it got blocked by this internal voice that said to me, "You're a piece of shit. People like us do not write books. People like us do not become artists. People like us do not break out of this reality. Be grateful." So people didn't only kind of warn you to stay where you were, they also practically attacked you. In philosophy, this is known as Plato's cave. Plato wrote about this cave analogy. He said that people are like he said that people, I'll get this story right, bear with me. He said that people were, it was as though they were chained in a cave, and behind them was the light of the sun. So they were chained facing the wall of a cave, and all they seen on the wall of the cave was the shadows that was reflected from the incidents going on outside the cave. They couldn't turn and look at it, they just saw these shadows on the wall, and they believed that these shadows represented reality. In fact, they thought these shadows were reality. That was all there was. So they contented themselves to live within a cave and seeing shadows as reality. Eventually, one of these people thinks, "I'm going to try and go out and find something different. There must be something else out there." So he breaks free from his chains. He makes his way out of the cave, and of course the first thing that happens when he comes out of the cave is he's hit by light, and he's blinded for a second and he's fearful. But once he adjusts to the light, once he's out there and he adjusts to the light, he realises that actually the shadows in the cave aren't reality at all. They're just a kind of a facsimile, just a shadow of reality, and what's out there is infinite and amazing, and the potentialities are just wonderful. So this guy sees what reality is. But what happens? He comes back into the cave and he says to people, "What you're looking at on the wall there is not really reality. It's just a shadow of reality. It's just a reflection of reality. It's a facsimile. It's nothing like the real thing. The real thing is very beautiful. It's very vast. It's full of potentiality." What most people do is they say the guy that comes back in the cave is mad. They ridicule him, and often, sometimes they attack him as well. And we've seen this, throughout history, and with various people that try to point the masses towards the light. People often get attacked for it. What I'm doing is I'm saying to you, I've been a guy in a cave looking at this shadow of reality, and innately knowing that there's something bigger out there, there's something better out there. And I'm one of these people that's gone out and actually done something about it, experienced it, and obviously been fearful, been afraid, but got the elixir of that journey and bringing it back and passing it on to people like yourselves. So that's what I did. I was working in a factory. I kept getting depression. I was suffered a lot from depression because every time this creative urge came up, it got knocked out again by these internal voices and by these external influences. And I got so fed up of being depressed and being battered by depression, and this depression just wandering into my life, kicking me and battering me and saying, my name's depression, see you again next week. I got so tired of being bullied by my own fears, by my own feelings, that I decided I was going to sit down, I was going to draw a pyramid on a piece of paper, and on each step of the pyramid I was going to put down one of my fears. That's what I was going to do. And then I was going to go out and I was going to hunt these fears down. I was going to be a night traveller, as the poet Rumi says, and I was going to confront these fears and overcome them. I was going to develop desensitization to fear. I was going to develop hardiness by confronting the things I feared most, because I suspected that these fears had no reality other than from my own projection. I suspected that they were inside me, but they didn't really exist in the real world. And I was true. This comes from one of the miracles of Francis. Francis of Assisi had a debilitating fear of lepers, and he in one of his prayers he said to God, I have this debilitating fear of lepers. And God said to him, I want you to go out tomorrow, I want you to find a leper, I want you to embrace the leper, and I want you to kiss the leper on his cracked, bleeding lips. And the best thing I love about this story is not, because you imagine Francis spoke to God or his higher self. You imagine Francis spoke to God and he says, oh yeah, of course, if that's what you want me to do, that's what I'll do. But he didn't. Francis kicked off. Francis was very fearful. In his mind, he really attacked God. He said, I can't believe you're asking me to go and kiss a leper. I tell you this fear in confidence, and you want me to go out there and you want me to kiss a leper. And he was so angry. But of course, once he settled down, he realised that something very big was guiding him. It was guiding him towards a very big lesson. So the next day, he trusted in this feeling. He went out and he found a leper, and he embraced the leper, and he kissed the leper on the cracked, bleeding lips. Then he picked the leper up and wrapped him in a coat and took him to the nearest refuge. But he'd only been walking a few feet when the leper started to feel lighter and lighter. And eventually he couldn't really feel the leper at all. So he unfolded the coat and realised that the leper had disappeared, the leper had gone. And this is one of the accredited miracles of Francis, and what it was saying to us metaphysically is that fear does not exist. It has no reality other than in our own mind. But it is a persistent illusion, as Einstein says. It's a persistent illusion. Until you fully embrace it, until you kiss it on the leper lips, until you give it love, this fear will not dissipate. So this is all about turning into discomfort, about turning into fear. And I know that's true. I know that's true because my fears were so real to me that I was actually afraid of living. Like Reinhold Messner when he was climbing Nanga Parbat, which was an inhospitable mountain. No one had ever climbed it to the top without oxygen. First time he climbed, he failed. The second time he climbed with his brother, and his brother died on the mountain. And Messner himself got stuck in the middle of the mountain. And this is one of the most revered. This is one of the most revered mountaineers of all time. Even he's a mountaineer's mountaineer. When you see him on television, he's all craggy and experienced and wizened. But this kind of beautiful, brave man who looked like he'd been cut out of stone is sat on the mountain halfway up, too afraid to go further up, too afraid to come back down, too afraid to stay where he is. At that point, he said, he was afraid to live, and he was crying for his wife. He was crying to be back down the mountain again. And I love that because that's how I felt. I felt so afraid to move forward. I felt so afraid to move back. I felt so afraid to stay where I was. I was afraid of life. And I cried a lot, and it made me feel normal to recognise that somebody like Reinhold Messner, he wrote a great book called Nanga Parbat Solo. But it's great to read that someone like Messner felt the same fears and had to fully embrace the fears until the fears dissipated. So what we're told by all the Bibles and what we're told by all the philosophers and what we're told by ourselves innately is that these fears don't exist, but we have to fully embrace them before that becomes a reality. So I wrote down this fear pyramid, and I systematically started to confront my fears, and at the bottom of the pyramid it was just general fears, like a fear of going to the dentist. I hadn't been to the dentist for years, and I had a fear of spiders, and it seems silly, but you know, at that time if I went to bed and there was a spider in the corner of the room, I wouldn't be able to sleep. So I started to climb the pyramid. I went to the dentist, I found a spider and kept picking it up until I was completely desensitized. I had a fear of karate tournaments at the time. So I went and entered the very first tournament that came up, which was, I think it was the Liverpool Open, which was one of the toughest tournaments in Shotokan in the country. And I entered the tournament. And I got this desensitization to these fears very, very quickly. The top fear, the fear at the top of my pyramid, was the fear of violent confrontation. That's a very difficult fear to overcome because it feels very real. So what I did was I got myself a job as a nightclub doorman, as a bouncer, and I went on that job, into that job, hoping that I'd be able to go and just spend a night or a week and overcome my fears. And I ended up staying there for almost a decade, and got lots of experiences and developed lots of sovereignty in myself. But the point is, I overcame the fear, and of course it seems peripheral, but overcoming my fear of violence enabled me to overcome my fear of becoming a writer. Because of course it wasn't until I became a nightclub doorman that I realised the reason I didn't write was because I was afraid to write. Because what does writing do? Writing makes you a city on a hill. It makes you visible. People see you, people judge you. Some people will dislike you just because you've written a book, just because you put your head above the parapet. So I was afraid of all that. And working on the door, where people are trying to kill you for no other reason than they've had a drink and they're displacing a shit life on you, made me realise that, you know, writing a book was nowhere near as difficult as that, or being a published author was nowhere near as difficult as that. So I went from being a normal factory worker to working as a nightclub doorman. And I remember distinctly standing on that door, this soft kind of kid, still quite young, in my 20s. I remember standing there with these hardened veterans, John Anderson and Colin Maynard and Ricky Jabba James and Winston, and some very awesome characters, and thinking, I'm doing this, I'm here, I'm actually doing it. And it was the actual doing it, is the actual standing in the middle of my fear, is the actual confrontation of it, that changed my reality. Because I just remember thinking, if I can become a nightclub doorman, then I could write a book. And if I could write one book, I could write 10 books or 40 books. And if I can write a book, I can write a film. And if I can write a film, I could do a play. And if I could do a play, well, I could make a living from writing. I could sell everything up if I wanted to and travel around the world. I could become a mountaineer. I could become an artist. Most of all, I could become what I was put on this planet to become. For me, that was about writing and teaching. It was about developing myself, you know, exploring my potential. That's what I knew I could become. And through the experiences, I found out what my natural bias was, what my true will was, the one thing that I was naturally good at, the one thing I was drawn to do. And when I realised what that was, and I realised how fertile the soil was there, that's all I did. I just spent my days writing. I mean, at one stage I was a full-time martial artist, and I can't tell you how exciting that is. When I've spent the first, you know, I think I was 32 when I left my normal job, but you know, I've done normal jobs ever since I left school, since I was 16, where you have to clock in, you have to clock out, you know, you have to work your 40 or 50 hours, and you're doing jobs that are below your pay grade. You know, you're doing jobs that you know you can do something much more. You know you're in the wrong place. So I can't tell you how exciting it was to suddenly be out there, running down the road at 6 in the morning and thinking, this is my job, this is what I do. And teaching people in classes and saying, this is my job. It's my job to teach people. And writing articles for magazines and saying, this is my job. and then getting a film made and being on a film set and saying, this is my job, this is what I do. And I've had that freedom for 20 years. And I know I'm probably making it sound romantic, because it is romantic, but it obviously wasn't without its difficulties, because, as they say, you know, if you create a new reality, you have to destroy an old reality. So you have to leave old realities behind, and that's very difficult, because when you leave old realities behind, of course you leave old friends behind sometimes. Well, you don't leave them behind, they just don't come with you. You know, you leave old habits behind, you leave old thinking behind. So there's a lot of sadness there, although it's very exciting, there's a lot of sadness there as well. But ultimately it's very exciting, because suddenly you're out in the world, and instead of, you know, doing a job where you know you could do something better, you suddenly sat at 2 in the morning drinking coffee with your heroes. I mean, I ended up in Las Vegas with Chuck Norris drinking tea, talking about when he used to spar with Bruce Lee, you know, and that kind of thing doesn't happen to people like me. That's what I'd always been told. But of course, becoming a doorman, getting my book published, made me realise that's not true. I can do anything. And Chuck Norris actually said that to me. He said, you could do this. Anybody could do this if they dared to do it. So that was my first book. That was what changed my whole reality. And I was very excited, and the idea of getting published was very exciting. But in the back of my mind, I don't think I really believed it would happen. But of course it did get published. That was the first version of Watch My Back. It's a very thin version. It was a very original version. I eventually did 3, Watch My Back, Bouncer and On the Door. And later on I put them together into one big book. I retold the stories in chronological order and put them into one big book, which later on became a feature film, Clubbed. And if you see the pictures in here, that's me and Sharon on the set of Clubbed. So suddenly, a reality that I created through the nib of a pen, don't forget this reality started here, in these notepads, with a biro, in a factory toilet where I was hired to sweep floors. So this whole reality squeezed itself out of the point of a pen, and then suddenly became a £2 million feature film, which premiered in the West End in London, and premiered in Paris. We went to Paris for the premiere, and you're suddenly thinking, nobody is going to tell me that we can't create bigger, better, brighter things, that we can't experience other realities, that we can't create other realities, because we can. Of course we can. And what I like about me, what I love about me, what I love about my life, is that I am very ordinary. I worked in factories until I was 32. I went to comprehensive school. I left with no qualifications. I've spent the rest of my life educating myself. I've built my own library, but I left with no qualifications. And my life was destined to be, you know, working in factories. And there's nothing wrong with working in factories, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to experience more. I'm an ordinary person living an extraordinary life. That means if I can do that, it means you can do that. Maybe you won't do it as a writer, maybe that's not your natural bias, maybe you want to be an artist, maybe you want to be a mountaineer, maybe you want to be a frisbee thrower, I don't know. Everybody's a little bit different, and everyone's got to find their own natural bias. But if I can do it from a factory floor, you know, from a working class background, from an uneducated background, if I can do it, then it shows you intellectually, and obviously you can retrace the steps, you can see the lineage, you can see that it's true, it's possible. And someone like me is invested in telling you it's possible, because you know, I love people. I want people to, you know they've got a choice. I mean, it's not in my interest to try and force people to go and do stuff they don't want to do. It's just to say to people that are searching, if you want more, if you want to create more, you can. It's possible. People are doing it. And it's not because you're lucky, and it's not because, you know, you've had privileges, and it's not because, you know, you had a foot up. You know, that's not true. It's happened because you've gone out there and you've explored it. One of the things I realised from my early days was that I used to blame people a lot. I used to blame, it was my ex-wife's fault, it was the manager's fault at the factory, you know, it was my parents' fault, it was the school's fault. The schools are rubbish, they don't educate properly. You know, it was society's fault for not recognising the likes of me. You know, there was a conspiracy against working class kids. You know, it was the government's fault for not helping enough. It was God's fault for not gifting me enough. There was always someone to blame. And of course, the more you look for blame, the more you found. And what I realised was that was completely disempowering. And I'll tell you the time I realised it was when I was working on shifts in court halls, and I hated it. I hated working nights and afternoons and mornings. It was depressing. I became very hardy by doing it, but I did dislike it. And I worked there for 7 years, and I always blamed my wife. I always used to say, if it wasn't for my wife, I would be gone. You wouldn't see me for dust. I wouldn't be in this job. If it wasn't for my wife, I wouldn't be working here. If it wasn't for the fact that my wife insists I stay here because the money's good on shifts, if it wasn't for that, I'd be gone. And one day, this is my ex-wife, she got a bit fed up of me bleating and making excuses. And she said to me, if you don't like your job so much, why don't you go and change it and stop blaming me? And I nearly fell over. Because I realised when I'd been given permission, when I'd lost my source of blame, when I'd lost someone to blame, I suddenly realised it was nothing to do with her. I didn't move because I was afraid to move. I didn't write books because I was afraid to write books. I didn't, I didn't go into the martial arts more seriously because I was afraid to do that. I didn't explore my potential because my potential frightened the life out of me. That was the first time I realised it, and that was the first time I realised that will always be two queues. And it says this in the Quran. It says in the Quran, when you die, there will be two queues, and the longest queue will be full of excuse makers. And the Holy Prophet says, do not be in the queue of excuse makers. And he says when he wanders down the line of the excuse makers and people